السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. باسمي وباسم منسوبي لجنة الإفلاس وزملائنا في وكالة وزارة التجارة للأعمال التجارية والاستثمار وشركاؤنا في شركة رولاند برجر، يسرنا أن نرحب بكم جميعا في هذه الندوة استكمالا لجهود اللجنة في رفع كفاءة إجراءات نظام الإفلاس وتمكين تطبيق النظام وتعزيز فعالية تنفيذ أحكامه وإيجاد الحلول للممارسات التجارية وإيضاح الإجراءات. نبدأ ندوتنا اليوم وعنوانها إدارة الأزمات، دليل عملي لإعادة هيكلة الشركات. ننوه بأن العروض ستقدم باللغة الإنجليزية، وللاستماع إلى اللغة العربية يرجى اختيار اللغة الألمانية من أسفل الشريط لوجود الترجمة الفورية الصوتية. ستتاح المحادثة للجميع ويراها المتحدثين ومنظمي الندوة. كما نسعد باستقبال أسئلتكم واستفساراتكم في نطاق موضوع الندوة من خلال توجيه الأسئلة من الشريط الأسفل Q&A للإجابة عنها، ويفضل باللغة الإنجليزية. كما نذكر بأن اللجنة تتيح خدماتها في الموقع الإلكتروني وتستقبل الأسئلة والاستفسارات من خلال القنوات الرسمية، وهي الرقم الموحد ومركز التواصل الإلكتروني على موقعنا ووسائل التواصل الاجتماعي. شركاؤنا في هذه الندوة من شركة رولاند برجر، وهي شركة استشارية عالمية جمعت لنا نخبة من منسوبيها ضيوف هذا المساء، وهم ساسان حاتم شريك رولاند برجر في فرع الشرق الأوسط، الأستاذ سعيد السيد مسؤول أول إدارة المشاريع. الآن أدعو الأستاذ ساسان حاتم لبدء فعالية هذه الندوة. تفضل أستاذ ساسان.
Thank you very much, Abdulhamid. Thank you very much, first of all, to the Bankruptcy Commission to have created this space for us. Actually, it's myself and Said who will be your guides today. We have prepared three short chapters, each roughly half an hour. Each chapter is 15 minutes where we share our thoughts, and then roughly 15 minutes reserved for question and answers. So the three topics are building a successful restructuring plan. What does it actually take to renegotiate debt with banks in such a situation? And a bit of a real life flavor of one restructuring case that we did here in the region. Well, that's myself, that's Said. I'm actually heading our corporate performance improvement turnaround and restructuring practice in the Middle East, and Said is one of our most experienced project managers in this space. Now, I don't want to bore you with who Roland Berger is, just 30 seconds. We're actually a global firm. We're of German origin. Today in 30 plus countries. We have been for roughly 15 years in the region. And, you know, really what we stand for is, one of our key pillars is actually turnaround and restructuring services. We have done, you know, 10,000 projects as a firm to date. And that includes as well a variety of projects here in the region, and later in this session we're going to explore one of these cases. Now let's get really into the meat. So what does it take to build a successful restructuring plan? First, let's briefly set the scene. A company can go through different stages of crisis, a strategic crisis, an earnings crisis, and ultimately a liquidity and going concern crisis. And to state the obvious, you know, ideally transformation should happen as early as possible and actually prevent that a company hits an earning or worse liquidity crisis. And this is why there is the common saying that, you know, bankruptcy is almost always management's fault. Now, the more advanced the crisis, the less room for maneuvering. And today we really focus on how to help a company rebuild from a restructuring situation. Now, in theory, the recipe is very simple. Number one, prevent the ship from sinking, meaning safeguard liquidity, cut obvious fat, secure financing standstill agreements, apply a standard cookbook to flex working capital and release non-core assets as fast as possible. Number two, well, you need a good restructuring concept that ultimately allows to secure support from key stakeholders, and that's particularly shareholders and banks, to in a first step get the green light for the financial restructuring. And then number three, well, you need a rigorous and a ruthless execution. So this begs the question, well, why is it in practice so difficult to get it right, and how to maximize chances for success? So first, let's assume, and that's actually a big if, but let's assume you have found the right restructuring concept. Well, then implementation is the make or break for a successful turnaround. And while there are many possible reasons why implementation can fail, I would like to highlight today two issues frequently seen. Number one, companies are tempted to execute too many initiatives at the same time. And truth to be told is, you need discipline to execute the restructuring plan in line with shifting priorities. And in the beginning, the priority is really to stop the bleeding and make financial restructuring happen. And then over time, it's you work on the other initiatives, be it operational improvements or more bold strategic moves. And ultimately, it's a multi-year journey, for continued excellence. Issue number two, truth to be told, and that shouldn't come as a surprise, companies often do not have the required in-house capabilities to manage large-scale transformation programs or to deliver on some of the specific turnaround initiatives, let's say procurement excellence, category management, and so forth. And lastly, making change happen, we all know it intuitively, it's all about the people. And unfortunately, often too little effort is spent on changing company culture and people's mindset to truly anchor change in the organization. Now, enough for now with regards to implementation. In the last chapter today, we'll go back to a real life restructuring case and shed some light on what worked and what didn't work and why. So let's go back to the question of what is needed to get the restructuring concept right. And the very simple starting point is that when you are facing an advanced crisis, the restructuring needs to be holistic, it needs to be viable, and it needs to be convincing. And in many cases, the restructuring concept is simply not. It needs to consider strategic realignment, operational improvements, and financial restructuring. And all three, need to really go hand in hand. Now, did you know that companies that only go through financial restructuring as opposed to a holistic approach that covers strategic, operational, and financial restructuring, did you know that 70% of those companies are back to square zero after only 18 months? Meaning, again, in the need of financial restructuring, but this time with even less room for maneuver. So in many ways, it's just like a diet, without, truly changing some of your other lifestyle choices. Too often in the process, you actually fail. Now, the question then is how to get to a realistic and convincing restructuring concept. And Now, the theory, again, on paper is very simple. You design the concept and you flesh it out in a more detailed plan, and in the process, you bring stakeholders on board and generate the buy-in. Now, let's have a bit of a closer look, because in practice, it's actually not that easy, and there are quite a few hurdles that need to be overcome. So, the restructuring concept really starts, and that's a really important point, with the root causes of the current crisis and of the historical performance. But that's actually not the point. Yes, you need to understand the history, but ultimately this needs to be boiled down in a very of the true root cause of what is going wrong, what went wrong in this company. So you really need to cut through the noise and single out what went wrong. And yes, the answer is typically not a single factor. It's a mix of factors, be it market realities that have shifted, but the company was just too slow to react, or there was a fantastic expansion strategy, but in practice it failed, or many other factors. Now, the root cause analysis that goes hand in hand with a rapid review of the market context, particularly the competitive position, threats, opportunities, and a view on internal strengths and weaknesses. And ultimately, this leads to the centerpiece of any restructuring concept, which is, well, what is actually the value creation potential? And very specifically, well, what are the measures that need to be taken to make this happen? Now, restructuring is really about restoring sustainable financial health. Hence, it shouldn't come as a surprise that a cornerstone of any concept is to provide a clear view on how to close a performance gap. Now, here, what you see on the screen is a high-level waterfall, how future cash is envisioned to be generated. That's actually from a real project. Where you see on the left on the graph, EBITDA from measures, this is where, if we had time now, we would again zoom in and dissect all these incremental EBITDA contributions by type of measure: procurement spend optimization, headcount optimization, plant floor optimization. And when we get to the third chapter, the real life case study, we will actually drill down in a real life example into one of those. Now, once the high level concept has been endorsed, this concept actually needs to be detailed into a proper restructuring plan, where you move from a clear strategic direction, a top-down quantified view on key improvement levers and key risks need to believe analysis, to actually cascaded restructuring measures that link into a business plan, a target capital structure, and obviously there is a plan how to execute this. Now, it's probably worth spending a bit of time on the business plan. Now, the business plan, which includes the P&L, balance sheet, and cash flow statement, really needs to be resilient. For example, a heavy emphasis really, or key question is, well, what is a realistic time until those measures kick in? How long does it take you to actually execute them? And then again, how long does it take until those are reflected in your financials, right? And this is as well when you need to reconcile restructuring priorities with an organization's ability to digest change, because you cannot simply do everything at the same time. Now, there are many ingredients to a successful restructuring plan. But I would like to highlight three. Be ambitious but realistic, be ready to selectively invest, and factoring in the forgotten enablers. So let's briefly explore each three of these. Does that look familiar? Well, actually, many restructuring business cases look exactly like this. And obviously, turnaround needs to be fast, but the question is this actually realistic? Is it viable? Do you have the capabilities to execute this? And obviously, you know, you can aim for the moonshot and you want to become the next Apple, or you know, whatever is the reference in the given industry you're in. But typically, you're well advised to aim to be in the second quartile of top performers. So for example, when you look at your cost position, can you achieve to move from where you are today, perhaps in the third or fourth quartile, into the second quartile? Now, time to bust a myth, because it's actually not all about cost cutting. Yes, you know, lean, mean cost structure is important. It's part of any restructuring concept, but you need to be willing to selectively invest, be it in the right talent, technology, building or acquiring new product and service capabilities, or bringing on board the right advisors. And this point is very closely linked actually to the next key success factor, what I like to call the forgotten enablers. And this is people and technology. So first of all, talent management, or rather the lack thereof. So I think it's an open secret that, you know, many companies, not all, but many companies in the region focused for years on accelerated growth, and HR simply didn't keep up the pace. So you see poor performance evaluation systems, weak training programs, no succession planning for critical positions, to name just a few examples. And the same in technology, you know, technology, and that sounds counterintuitive given all the talk about digitization, but the reality is often fundamentally different, right? So for example, we worked for a large GCC construction company. They have $1 billion in revenues, more than 20,000 employees, and the business is run on Excel. So, you know, that obviously puts certain limitations, and people in IT are key enablers of any transformation, not only a restructuring journey. But getting it right is a multi-year journey. And the starting point and understanding the starting point is really critical. And sometimes the starting point can be rather poor. And then the key is really to initially focus on fixing the basics before you embark on a more ambitious plan. And finally, you know, to master restructuring situations, support from key stakeholders needs to be secured. And that actually would be the bridge to the next chapter, where Said will discuss what it actually takes to negotiate with banks. And I would like to use the opportunity now to open the floor for Q&A. There was obviously a very quick and rapid overview of restructuring, so please feel free to ask questions.
تفضل اللي عنده أحد الأسئلة. We can get the first question. Mr. Sassan, in Q&A, what the general definition of the market threats? How can we spot this kind of difficulties?
Sorry, can you repeat it? What's the general definition of?
In Q&A, you can see all of the answer of the attendees.
Q&A. All right. Fantastic. What is the general definition of market threats? How can we spot this kind of difficulties? Very good question. Very difficult to answer, truth to be told. look, I mean, this is anything that is external to you, to your company, and that could have an adverse effect. So, one example could be, shifting consumer behavior. Let's look at the current situation. COVID, people shift to online rather than go to a shop. So, such a change can be a threat if you're not readily positioned for that. Another one, let's say you are an industrial company and suddenly there is another competitor opening shop and doubling the capacity, production capacity that's available in the country, and as a result, there is overcapacity, and this is obviously putting pressure on prices. These are just two particular examples. I think it's all about having your eyes and ears in the market, and sometimes just step back and get out of the business as usual mindset. So strategic thinking exercises at least once a year are typically a helpful tool to look at the market situation, the competitive context, and ultimately what threats and opportunities those can present. And a particular trend can be a threat, but it can be as well an opportunity if you manage to anticipate it early enough and jump on it.
Next question.
Typically, how responsive are companies in the Middle East, especially family-owned, when numerous cutbacks are required? Look, I think obviously the context in the Middle East is specific. Now, when we talk about family-owned businesses, obviously we always need to bear in mind that often these are really close to the heart of the owners, of the founders, and this can be then more emotional discussions. I think that's important to bear in mind and to reflect in the approach. I think in general any business owner wants to see his or her business succeed. So in that sense, it's not fundamentally different. But yes, when it comes to difficult decisions, particularly about perhaps shutting down some of the business lines, this can be particularly challenging to take such decisions. Can M&A or divestitures be part of restructuring? Yes, absolutely, and in fact, it often is. So one of the elements to look at always are what is actually your core business and what shouldn't be your core business. And assets or business lines that are not part of the core business, the answer often is to actually divest. And when it comes to new acquisitions, this can be as well part of the concept to reposition the company in the market, but this typically is something that comes at a bit of a later stage, meaning you have actually got the situation under control, you have at least partially overcome the crisis, you have new financial backing in place, you have proven on other measures that you actually can turn around the company. So for example, first cost-cutting measures have taken place and are successful. And then M&A comes into play. That's the general cookbook, but obviously, or depending on the specific situation, you might as well anticipate such a move if the right financial backing is there.
Now we can go to سعيد السيد for talk. تفضل أستاذ سعيد لإدلاب الورقة الموجودة عندك.
Thank you, Sassan, very much for walking us through that part. Those very interesting ideas and thoughts. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's here. وشكرا جزيلا للجنة لاستضافتنا في الندوة. To build on from the section that we just went through with Sasan, which is a restructuring from an overview perspective, we're now going to walk through the section of our presentation, which is how to prepare for negotiating debt with banks. And we're going to look at it mainly from the perspective of a bank. And it's very interesting, or it's very important to know the perspective of a bank, especially for companies and shareholders, to understand how does a bank look at a restructuring, because that really helps with coming up with the right plan and the right strategy to be able to push through the required restructuring and achieve the results that companies and shareholders are out to achieve. So from a bank's perspective, there are three general, if we go to the next slide, there are three general approaches that a bank takes when they're faced with a company that's at a risk of insolvency or is distressed. And these three ways are to liquidate or wind down the company, restructure, reorganize it, or sell or transfer their exposure to another lender. And there are reasons why a bank would undertake either or of these paths. And for instance, on the liquidation and wind down, it's basically when a company has no viable restructuring plan. The bank does not see a way for this company to exist anymore, and that could be because of industry. For the industry, there's structural changes in the industry. The company itself is not able to perform, is no longer a going concern. What typically happens there is the bank will take over the assets and go through a fire sale, where they try to sell off the assets as quickly as possible to recover value and close out their exposures. The second way, and a very popular way, and what we're going to look more deeply into in the next 30 minutes, is to restructure and organize. And this is a preferred method because it's a win-win situation if it's successfully achieved. And the bank needs to be convinced that there is a case that the company and the shareholders put forward to get out of the distressed situation the company's in and go back into being in a healthy state and a going concern and covering its debt obligations and growing. And this usually involves, contributions from shareholders, a change in management, and other things that we'll go through in more detail in the next chapter. And finally, the last thing, and generally, we see it happen, but not as much as a restructuring, which is the bank sometimes does not want to increase its exposure to your industry or company, or just simply wants to exit from the company, does not want to go down the journey. And to do this, they sell or transfer their exposure to another potential lender or bank or other fund per se. And I think the next couple of slides we'll focus more on the restructuring aspect. So in a bank, and this is very general, there are different banks with different structures. But generally, there's around 3 layers in any bank that you go to. And these 3 layers, expand or condense depending on whether you're looking at a local bank, international bank, Islamic, conventional, established, or small. But these 3 layers generally exist across the banks. And the 3 layers are very important to understand when you're approaching a bank for negotiating debt. And the first layer, which almost everyone's familiar with, is the relationship officer. And these are the guys that we typically call bankers, right? And these bankers are extremely commercially driven. And what that means is their aim is to generate new business or maintain existing business and collect fees and make sure that there's a profitable relationship between the bank and its clients. And the relationship officer is generally the officer that knows the relationship, knows the client the most, and understands the situation the most, and has more at stake than anyone else in the bank, because this client and these fees come under his review, right? And that typically makes the relationship officer your ally when you're going through a restructuring, because he will push for your case from within the bank because it's in his benefit to do so. So it's very important to understand what the relationship officer does within the bank. The second layer, which is the credit committee, we say, or the division or the credit department, or these change as you go across banks, but this is the layer that steps between the commercially driven guys and the decision makers. And their job is to look at your historical performance, right? And look at several different areas like character and market, and come up with a recommendation on your credit quality, right? How good are you at basically covering your debt obligations? What is your leverage situation, right? And what is the viability of your financial performance going forward? And they do this by looking at your historicals, right, and analyzing this, and also looking at your projections and seeing if they make sense on an isolated basis and on a basis compared to the rest of the industry. The third and very important layer is basically the committee, the executive committee layer, or chief risk officer, and you'll generally know the former most, which is the executive committee or investment committee or those committees that basically will review the case, ensure there's a balance between the exposure of the bank to the different industries, and if everything's okay, they will generally approve the loans that a client would need. Now, if you're at risk, you will be introduced to the chief risk officer or the restructuring desk within a bank, and their job is basically to ensure recoverability for the bank, right? You are in a situation where you've put their asset at risk, and they need to make sure that they're taking the right steps and precautions to ensure that their asset value is protected. And we'll look at it a bit more later, but it's very important to understand these different layers when you're approaching a bank, because that's generally the path that's taken within the bank to approve or deny or work with you in your restructuring. If we go to the next slide, we'll look at the different basically options that are available during a restructuring, right? And as a company that is in a distressed situation, there are several things that you can apply for or pursue to make your basically debt exposure a little easier on you while you restructure the company. And these different options are generally taken, either individually or as a bundle. And I've seen a situation where, a company was pursuing 5 out of the 6 options that you see on this page. Now, they go from left to right. You see the level of difficulty of bank buy-in, right? And we see basically the easiest thing to do here is to ask for a covenant reset or waiver. And what that means is, you're a company that's just gone through a period that's put them, a bad period, or expecting to go through a bad period in the upcoming year. And they basically ask the bank to waive the covenants that they have on their loans, or reset the covenants if there was a structural change in the industry and the financials now look different. And it's a very, very simple, straightforward sort of ask from the banks. And these become more difficult as we go to the right, and we look at moratoriums or grace periods where a company is expecting, for instance, a major payment to come in, and it hasn't come in and it's delayed by 2 or 3 months. You can apply for a moratorium or a grace period to the bank. So I like to give you some breathing room while you collect your payments in order to basically fulfill that obligation at the right time. And then as we go more to the right, you see complexity in the process, because you're basically asking the bank to take basically a position that is unfavorable to them. And if we go all the way to the right, you see an option here is to ask for haircuts or a write-off on a portion of borrowings. And generally, banks, is the last thing they want to do is to reduce their assets, right, and reduce their exposure to you. And the only way they'll be able to entertain this is if the company is able to demonstrate a really convincing restructuring case, right, with a strong value preservation creation, that if you go along with me here right now, there is value to be realized later. If we go to the next page, the most important thing really when you're undergoing a restructuring is most companies generally tell their bankers at they're the last to know basically about what's going on in the company, because you don't want your bank to start knocking on your door too early. And by the time you tell them what's going on, you're really in a distressed situation. And that really breaks the trust and transparency that exists between a bank and a company. So the job of the company here is to really regain this credibility, reestablish this trust, and provide the transparency to the bank to allow them to work with you to achieve this restructuring, because you can't do this alone. You need the banks on your side. And to get the banks on your side, there are several things that you need to be doing to regain this credibility. And first and foremost, you need to be very honest and upfront about the reasons of distress. What's caused the distress in your company? Have you identified it? Have you analyzed it? Have you looked at it? Is there something you can do about it? And you need to communicate that to the bank so they're on the same page as you. No matter how harsh it is both your interest to know rather than not to know. The second thing is you need to make sure that your plan is realistic and achievable, right? You have to have a plan, you have to have scenarios, you have to have really thought about what's driving your plan, what are the assumptions behind it, are they achievable? And you need to also be able to communicate that to the bank to bring them on your side. Third, it's very important sometimes to have an independent party, look at your plan and back it, right? When you go to a bank, generally the bank, like we're saying here, has lost some trust in the company, and will carry that taste when it's looking at your plan. Having an independent party back your plan really goes a long way with the bank, because they will trust that there's an objective eye that's looked through the plan and has given a recommendation on this. The fourth point is you need to increase your governance and strengthen this change management. Usually when companies in distress, there are people within management that have not done the right things, right? And to show the bank that you are really committed to turning around and really committed to bringing your state back into a healthy state, sometimes this takes a few steps in changing your own management and bringing the right people on board and the right professionals to take you through this time, but also putting the right governance in place, increasing controls where there's a lack of controls, and increasing transparency when there is no transparency. Finally, it's very, very important to organize your data and make sure it's readily available to the banks when they ask for this. And a big example of this is audits. And I've seen it a few times when a company is going to restructure something with the bank, and they've gained this momentum with the bank, and they're on board, and they're going through the final approvals, and it turns out they haven't completed their audits for the year. And then what happens there is you kill all the momentum. You take a few months now to complete an audit, and you've kind of lost all the credibility or all the good stuff that you've gained throughout the restructuring. So it's very important that by the time you approach the banks, you have everything in order and all your data and information is there and visible and clear and accessible to the bank. The next page, basically, we talk about what are the key success factors here. Now that you've established this credibility and regained this trust with the bank, what are some key success factors, things that you need to focus on in order to be able to demonstrate to the bank that this restructuring is viable and that the bank should entertain this and work with you to achieve what you set out to achieve. And those three things are basically ability to meet your obligations. Companies find themselves in distress when they're not generating enough cash to pay their debt. It's as simple as that. And your restructuring plan, your business plan, needs to demonstrate that over the next couple of years or months that you're going to turn this around and you're going to be able to generate enough free cash flow to meet your debt obligations at minimum, and over time be able to grow that even more to be able to reinvest in your company, undertake new projects, etc. The second thing is you need to offer to share risk, and that means you need to put skin in the game. You cannot ask the bank to take all the risk and do all the action necessary to help you out while you stand by. You have to offer something to the bank. And generally this means shareholders are required to put some skin in the game, and that could be a capital injection, that could be assets that sit outside the bank and they move them into the company, just to show the bank that we are willing to put our own personal net worth into this because we believe in the company, and we're asking you to believe in the company as well. Other forms of this could be a non-core asset sale or sale and lease backs, where you look at your portfolio and your company and you realize I have assets that are not really core to my operations. Maybe I can sell them and generate cash flow. This is something that will be appreciated by the banks. The third point is also to strengthen your collateral. At the end of the day, the bank will lend money if they have strong collateral backing that money. If they see a risk in the operations, they know that they have a strong collateral, and collateral could be a building and equipment, an asset, access to a bank account with cash flow in it, where they can recover their exposure, then that goes a long way. And finally, another method of sharing risk is to offer to the bank to set up new accounts that are under the control of the bank, where you route your cash flows through. This gives visibility to the bank, and it gives control to the bank, and shows them that you're willing to share control with them through this tough period. Finally, a key success factor is to maintain and grow a profitable relationship. At the end of the day, the bank is an institution that's looking to make profit as well. So if you're able to demonstrate that you can continue to meet your interest obligations, right, this is a plus for them. There are restructuring fees that I'm sure the bank will put, and you can offer as well, which are profit for the bank as well. But finally, and most importantly as well, you need to demonstrate that this relationship does not stop at the end of a restructuring, that you as a business want to go beyond and further. You want to generate new business. You are the partner that the bank needs in order to, to grow together. And both of you are going to make profits in this fruitful relationship. And if you're able to demonstrate this, then that goes a long way with the banks as well. If we go to the next slide, right, so here we're talking about that second layer now, the credit committee. And the credit committee is a very important gateway between the relationship officer and the decision makers. And they mainly focus on two things, which is your leverage position and your coverage position, right? And I briefly worked in corporate banking, and I did a lot of these. And honestly, there's that one table that the credit officers put together is a very important table, and it's heavily scrutinized in the bank. And it's basically showing key financial ratios historically and based on your projections, right, that determine your basically solvent position or the health of your financials, right? And generally a company that's in distress that we see in year 0 here, right, the ratios are all indicating a very insolvent company, right? There's very high leverage. They're not able to meet their interest obligations, right? Another bracket of ratios that the credit committee looks at are very industry specific or product specific. For instance, if you're a construction company that's looking for working capital financing, then the bank would go and analyze your historical working capital position and see, are you able to meet your projections of working capital based on their historical performance, and also check across the industry if it's realistic what you've put down as working capital expectations. And the idea here is that over time, you need to be able to demonstrate that these ratios are either increasing, decreasing, depending on the ratio, but you're generally moving towards a healthier state. Now, one thing companies should be doing here is you can do the job of the credit committee for them, and that's very important. When you present your restructuring plan, it is important sometimes to put these ratios up front in your restructuring plan, and kind of do the job of the credit committee for them, as well as when you're scenario testing and you're showing different scenarios to the bank based on your restructuring plan. You should always show these outputs, right? These are the ratios that you achieve if you go down scenario A or scenario B and scenario C. And that really, really helps the credit committee move your application faster. Finally, one more thing before we go to our key takeaways is there are several other considerations to keep in mind, right? The first is you've been dealing with a relationship manager this whole time. Once you're in distress, you're going to be introduced to the chief risk officer or the restructuring desk. And it's important, if you can, build a relationship with this chief risk officer and understand what he is looking for. What are the limitations that he's working with? Does the bank want to exit the industry as a whole? Does the bank, want, ABC? Oh, you can fulfill ABC, and that's what you go after. The second thing is to understand that the CRO, it's in his interest to solve or restructure as quickly as possible. So by working with him and moving this as quickly as possible, you are serving both your interests. And finally, continue to maintain a good relationship with the relationship manager. He is your ally, right? He is concerned about the commercial relationship between you two, right? And it's in his interest for you to do well, because that means more fees to the bank, and it means he's doing well in his job. The second thing is, typically in restructuring companies, they don't just have one bank and one lender. Sometimes companies have multiple banks, sometimes they have syndicates or multiple syndicates, and it becomes very complex to manage all these lenders. So one trick or one tip here is to identify within all your lenders or within different circles of lenders, who are their influencing bank? Who is the bank that's really that the other banks are leaning on? That's the loudest, that's holding the pen, or maybe the lead of your syndicate, and work with them to understand what the interests of the other lenders are, but also to influence that bank in hopes that they influence the other banks. Because it's much harder to deal with 20 banks rather than dealing with one bank that influences 19. The other thing is, all these different banks that you might be dealing with might have different interests. Now, it's important to align the interests across the bank, but you need to also understand that some banks might have a completely different requirement and interest. And understanding that early and building it into your restructuring plan is very useful and will go a long way when you approach the banks. Finally, and a very important point is to not overlook the minority lenders. They can hold all creditors hostage. And I've seen this in real life where, there was a syndicate where there's 100% unanimity required to make any decision. And you have these creditors who have the 2%, 1% position. They're very small and very easy for you to overlook, but they are equal in terms of voting for any plan. So make sure you cover all your lenders, no matter how small they are, and understand what their position is when you're approaching for restructuring. And the final consideration is an administration process or a bankruptcy process. And obviously no company wants to be there, but there are benefits of an administration or a bankruptcy process. The main one being is you generally get an instant moratorium or a grace period, right, which is granted for you to be able to develop your restructuring plan, for the creditors to formalize and form a committee, for a structured and heavily moderated, debate and discussion happening between the company and creditors to be able to come up with a restructuring plan that works for everyone. Now, the downfall of that is generally in an administration, the shareholders completely lose control of the company, and the credit committee is the one that's going to make key decisions here. So that's something to also consider. And I know this has been a very quick section. We'll just close off with a few key takeaways, and a very important point, that's renegotiating with banks or approaching banks is only the first step here, and this takes us back to the first section where Sasan was talking about a holistic restructure. There's so much more to do after you get your approvals in the banks, and it really relies on the people, the assets, the markets, technology, the investments required to achieve this plan now that you've got it approved. So a few key takeaways here, we need to understand that banks there is a trade-off at banks. They can go with liquidation or sell or restructure, and there are different reasons behind why a bank goes through that. Second, and then very importantly, company needs to quickly regain credibility and establish trust. Third, there are so many options available. Some require more conviction than others. So it's when choosing your options, make sure you have the right or convincing plan behind it. Fourth, a corporate bank, there are many layers within. They all have different interests, from commercial interests to risk interests, and understanding the process is helpful when coming up with your plan. And finally, the three considerations we talked to are important to keep in mind, which is a CRO, dealing with multiple lenders, and an administration. And I think we'll go now for Q&A. And I will open it here. There it is.
Okay, shukran. Thank you, Mr. Said. And we can read two questions for that type, because the first question is asking in Arabic, هل يوجد شركات مخصصة لعمل إعادة الهيكلة، وهل وزارة التجارة لديها قسم خاص لإعادة الهيكلة؟
شكرا أستاذ أنس فارسي. There are companies for restructuring. Roland Berger is one of the leading companies actually in restructuring globally and regionally, and we offer services to across industries and have been working and doing this for a long time. And if there is an actual need, then please reach out to Sasan or myself here. In terms of the Ministry of Commerce, I'm not too sure if they have a restructuring desk or office to go to, but please, if you want to reach out to us, then do let us know.
The next question, please, in Q&A.
what bankers should do when the right advice was given to corporate client, but do not believe this is necessary because they are biased towards their business and the way it is running. Look, and this is you know, this is a common problem. You know, people get really attached to their businesses and they become very emotionally invested in their businesses, and it's very hard to change when you're in that state. And that's why seeking independent or an objective view from a restructuring firm like Roland Berger is very important to basically, you know, give you a sanity check, give you a reality check, right? And I think this is the best way to tackle something like this. If you feel that the bank is requesting something that's not in line with how you're running your business and you've reached a deadlock with the bank, then reach out for help, right? Invest in help, right? Get the right help on board, get the right views, you know, do a quick assessment of who's right here and what's the situation. I think that would be the best way to tackle a problem like this.
Okay. Now, the next question I need to explain to Mr. Sassan in Q&A.
What are the early warning signals for identifying a potential restructuring? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I mean, actually, obviously, as highlighted in the beginning, I mean, the earlier an intervention is made, the earlier a company acts and can actually prevent a progression of a crisis, the better. And you know, the early warning signs will depend at the stage of the crisis, but you know, when you start seeing key financial indicators eroding, I think that's a first warning sign that, you know, this company might be on a slippery road. So when you look at profitability ratios, when you look at leverage ratios, when you look at cash flow ratios, and you know, 1 quarter, 1 year, you know, that's not necessarily a problem. But you know, if you see a continuous erosion or a dramatic drop, that's time when to ask questions. The same is if you overlay this with an industry perspective. I mean, there are some industries that are in a more difficult spot and more prone to disruption, right? So, you know, if you look at the cyclicality, let's take construction and related value chains, building materials, and so forth. I mean, these are, you know, these are industries that, you know, when, particularly in the region, when, you know, oil prices are falling, when government budgets are under pressure, can easily get hit, right? And that's an industry dynamic. It's a nature of the industry. So these are as well dimensions you can look at, or, you know, if you look at retail, obviously everyone knows retail is massively being disrupted with a shift to online, and some companies are better responding to these shifts than others, but it might be a worse first warning signal being aware of such industry dynamics and trends and having a look at how does a given company actually do against these trends.
Okay, the next question with Mr. Saeed. During these days with COVID-19 pandemic, based on your experience with various companies, what is the common major step need to be or has to be taken to prevent the ship from sinking? So, I mean, good question, very relevant. And the answer is simple, and that the step that needs to be taken to prevent the ship from sinking has to be that you should have built resilience in the company. And what does that mean, resilience in the company? Resilience means that you are able to weather the storm when the storm comes, and that means having enough, you know, cash flow buffers when you need them. That means having the right systems and controls in your receivables and payables, right? That everything is done according to, you know,
according to good standards. That when needed, you can unlock revenue opportunities that are different from the ones that you're doing now. You need to really think outside of the box on your revenue generation. And finally, is you need to be able to become really lean, really quick if you're really affected by the COVID pandemic, right? And by becoming lean means you need to take, corrective action on your cost structure. You need to find creative ways to compensate people in means that are different from purely cash, which you probably need as a buffer to weather through the storm. But there are different ways, but they all point to one place, which is you need to build resilience in your company. And I think Sasan, you can, if you want to add something here as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, perhaps just to add to this, I mean, obviously, something like the COVID-induced economic crisis is obviously an externality that is very difficult to prepare for. And I think any business, or almost any business except a few fortunate sectors, were really, really hard hit. And the degree, to which you are hit is to a large degree a function of the industry you're in. Obviously, tourism, retail, and so forth are particularly hit. Others are more protected. But I think Said's point is very valid, and it boils as well down to how fast can you actually control cost in such a difficult environment to at least survive until things gradually start to return to normal, or the new normal. I think that's one thing. The other thing is, the government in Saudi and other governments in the regions, they had the wisdom and the generosity to put a lot of support funds into the system. And this is obviously fantastic news, and many companies have benefited from that. But I think here the advice is to use that time that those funds have bought you wisely, and really rethink the business model, rethink the strategy, work on cost efficiencies, because chances are that, come end of this year, a lot of companies will be in a bad place because they did not act on actually the urgency that was out there, and they kicked down the can because they got debt repayment moratoriums, they got certain grants and wage supports, etc., etc. So I think here is really about, have a close look at the business. Where can you cut costs, where not? Sometimes some things you don't want to touch, you shouldn't touch, and how to reposition the business. But it's about acting fast.
Okay, thank you. And we have from attendee Hussam Sadaqa. Hussam.
Yeah, just a quick question, please. I just wanted to ask, how long do you think a complete restructuring would take for a small, medium, and large company in terms of hours or in terms of weeks? Just an indication so we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, I don't think there is a one size fits all, but I think an initial restructuring concept, right? That can be done anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the complexity of the business, the number of business lines, and so forth. And then the actual execution, typically that's a longer journey, right? But typically, the most critical items on the roadmap that should be done then in the first 6 to 9 months. But then typically you actually see that the full execution might last 2 to 3 years. I hope that's helpful as a rough guidance.
We can go to question and answers. how to analyze cash flow for the payment of debt?
It's a very open question, and there are different ways to look at cash flow depending on the situation. But in general, for firms, there is a concept of free cash flow, and that is generally the cash flow that's generated by the company before you pay any debt or before you pay any equity holders, and that's purely cash that's generated from operations. And banks really focus on that item, free cash flow, because this is the available cash flow to cover the debt obligation. So when you're looking at a company, you're analyzing a company, you need to be able to identify and extract their free cash flow and look at the free cash flow movement over the projection period, be it 5 years, 10 years, to be able to completely understand the ability of the company to meet its debt obligations.
Okay, we will get one question from the last of Q&A because that is older. Can we see that the last one?
Is it always advisable?
Yes.
That question?
This is always advisable.
Yeah. Is it always advisable to hire a restructuring consultant, or it all depends on the size of the company and debt? So so like we discussed, one of the key things that help companies regain credibility and establish trust with the banks is to get an independent party to back your plan, and it really depends on the degree of restructuring or the degree of how close you are to your bank, and how much help you need in backing up your business plan. It is always, generally advisable to get a third opinion, to get an independent advisor to help you with the restructuring. But I've seen some companies who have very close relationships with banks that they don't need this. They just, they can do this on their own. And these are typically small to medium companies. However, companies that are in distress, generally, not only are they facing problems and they've lost credibility with banks, but they don't have the manpower, or their people are not motivated enough to go through such an stressful exercise as a restructuring. So it is advisable to bring fresh eyes, fresh hands, and an advisor who's done or experienced your case multiple times to help you go through a restructuring. So whether you end up going with a restructuring advisor or not, if you are in a distressed situation, right, and you are facing this problem with a bank, it is advisable to reach out to an advisor or a consultant or a restructuring company to give you what their view on how they can help you with is, and make that decision then. But in general, it is important to get an independent party to back your plan. So it is advisable to always consider this option.
Okay, we will make the questions in the last of the symposium, and we can continue the workshop.
Okay, good. So we continue with the workshop. So last chapter, a glance on a real life restructuring case. Again, we have 30 minutes, including Q&A, so we can't go into a lot of detail, but I would like to give you at least a little bit of a flavor of what that means in practice. So background here, this is actually a large construction company in the GCC. It's not one of the largest, but fairly sizable, roughly $1 billion turnover, more than 20,000 employees. Now, when we came in, and again, this is a very simplified view, but the company was really in a position of weakness. I mean, profits had evaporated. In terms of net profit, it was close to zero or actually negative. Quickly saw that, they had grown internationally, but not with a lot of success. The balance sheet was, very, very stretched. Actually, sometimes I was thinking, is this a bank? You know, because the amount of receivables they had on their balance sheet, and you know how long they had been outstanding. This didn't look really like a construction business. This looked more like a finance business. And ultimately, obviously, markets had looked at this and said, "Oh, wait a second, that doesn't look good." So share price collapsed. So a starting point, really a starting point of weakness. And as we said, you know, really it's about understanding what's going wrong in a company and what needs to be fixed to be really able to shape a restructuring concept. Now in construction, I mean, that's a business that works today pretty much the same way as it did 50 years ago, if we're very honest. And it's all, I mean, large part of, you know, value is created or destroyed on the construction side, right? So, you know, who hasn't seen, you know, a couple of workers on the street and you see 10 guys, one is working and 9 are watching, right? In many ways, that's the epitome of what can go wrong. Obviously, there are many things that can go wrong, from, you know, lack of forecasting accuracy, you know, proper supervision on the site. You know, when you need this piece of machinery, it's broken, and hence, you know, work gets delayed. So there was a whole range of really operational performance issues. And if you lift this up, you know, the organization in this particular case had, you know, particular challenges. Just to give you one example, the CEO had more than 10 direct reports, actually 15. That's just not manageable, right? No human being is capable as a CEO of being on top of 15 executives. And perhaps another example, you know, the culture was in many ways toxic, right? It was, you know, it should be around driving solutions for problems. It was all about, you know, finger pointing. Oh, but you didn't send me this. Oh no, but you didn't tell me this. So that obviously doesn't work. You know, operations, truth to be told, and that's quite a common problem in construction. Sometimes a project is doomed from day one to be a loss maker. Why? Because when the bid was made, you didn't properly factor in all the risks and the costs, and you know, then you start executing, and over time, suddenly the profits evaporate, and you have a loss maker at hand. And obviously, you know, in that case, construction, you know, the market situation was not helping. That's now a few years back, but today it's similarly difficult, right? There's a lot of uncertainty about, you know, government-related projects and when they do pick up. And, you know, you have, you know, increasing labor costs with certain fees and so forth. So, you know, the status quo was really a challenging one. And what we did together with the client, and I think that's very important, the word together with, because, you know, as a consulting firm, an advisor, we might be restructuring experts, we might have the right industry expertise, but at the end of the day, a lot of the real know-how sits in the company, and sometimes they have large parts of the recipe of how to fix this. It just needs to be properly articulated, pulled together, prioritized, and synced up, right? So in that case, we came up actually with a restructuring program that revolved around 3 pillars. One, all focused on how to properly execute construction projects. So that included, for example, manpower planning. So, you know, going back to some of the issues they faced, they might have had a project where they urgently needed 100 people that know masonry, but they, you know, so they went out and hired, and they had another project, you know what, they just finished their work, they have top masonry people, but no one talks to anyone. So, you know, it was about, can we put some central planning in place, right? The second pillar, all around organizational processes and systems. So, for example, obviously, you know, when a CEO has 15 direct reports, it's very difficult to manage. So one of the ideas here was actually to introduce a COO role, to have a more balanced split, and a whole range of other topics that included as well selectively changing a few heads in the organization. That's always a very difficult step, but sometimes it's needed. It needs to be selective, and these are people where you need specific know-how that is missing today, and sometimes it's about bringing in people that have the right motivation for change and to drive change, rather than sticking to old routines. And then the third pillar, more a financial focus that included the actual financial restructuring, but as well as some G&A flexing and working capital optimization and similar measures. Now, important, in an ideal world, it's not always possible, but it should be always the ambition. While you come up with this restructuring concept, well, are there any things that we could consider quick wins? And why is that important? For many, many reasons. Sometimes those quick wins, to be honest, they are not a game changer in terms of actual financial impact. But if you get those quick wins right, you actually can prove to different stakeholders that, you know, there is a way to turn this around. It can create energy, it can create motivation with employees when they see actually things start moving. And the same for banks, for example. You know, when you can go out there and report that out of 5 quick wins, you have already implemented 4, and you see a real impact, even if it's small, that's something that helps in the process. Now, in this case, so there were these 9 initiatives that we saw before, along with these 30 measure packages, but obviously this needs to be then drilled down into proper action items. In this case, it was roughly 2,000 actions. An action can be something as high level as, let's go out and hire a CEO. That's something really that's at the attention of the board and the CEO. But it can be something as mundane as, well, you know what? The way we are doing tiling today is outdated. Why don't we actually do it the way, you know, best practice is done? So, which is something really at the bottom, which is something on site, at the construction site, at project manager level and supervisor level and his teams, right? Now, if you see here, so there were those 9 pillars. One of them was supply chain management / procurement. So to make it a bit more tangible, because all of this looks nice, but, you know, what is really behind it, I would like to dig a bit deeper into this initiative, supply chain management. And here you have 7 work streams that were designed. The first 3 are really the critical ones. One is on-time delivery. That matters because, you know, if you're waiting for paint and actually painting a wall or installing a heater is on your critical path and it's not there on time, this will delay your whole construction project, and you might end up with being slapped with late fees and penalties. The other one is category management, and this was all about, well, you know, we you know, as a firm, you know, we spend, you know, a lot of money on procurement, but if you're honest, you know, it's 40 type of categories, you know, let's say steel, cables, and so forth. Can we have a more structured look at how we procure these materials and ultimately bring price down, right? And then there are, you know, purchasing processes, you know, is there a way to make this more agile, faster, rather than being reactive? So remember, there were those 9 initiatives. One of them was supply chain management. Now supply chain management has 7 work streams. Now let's dig into category management. And they had 40+ categories, and I picked now out example joinery and formwork. And what happened there was actually, let's go in and see how is that money spent. And, you know, you could look at concentration of suppliers. You actually saw 5 suppliers on more than 80% of the purchased volume. Which categories within joinery and firm work is the money actually spent. And that was then taken to the next level, where the question was, well, what type of levers could we apply to actually optimize the spend for joinery and formwork? You could do some volume bundling, for example, rather than every individual project goes out and puts places in order for joinery. Well, why can't we bundle this across projects? Multi-year contracts. Can we cut out the middleman? Something very common in the Middle East. You have a local tradesman, and he sells you the wood that he imported from, let's say, Indonesia. Well, can you actually go straight to Indonesia and source that wood? And what we saw is that there's a savings range, and actually there was quite significant. And this exercise was then taken forward. So here, example, plywood. Yes, can you actually cut out the middleman? And the company went out, identified potential vendors abroad in Indonesia, and got price quotes. The material went to quality testing. Yes, it's actually good quality. There was significant savings potential that could be materialized. Now, the issue is, when we came back after a year, and we had a close look. Well, how are you actually doing in the implementation? Truth to be told is there was a significant change. There was a large step forward. The company was still alive. And you could see progress, you could feel progress, but like in many situations, there was more change needed faster. And in that particular case, when we looked at, well, actually what went wrong, right? Because only when you understand what went wrong, then you can address it. It boils down actually to two factors, right? Capability gaps and lack of discipline. And that's actually interesting because, when the restructuring concept is drawn up, in this case or in any other case, you need to be dead honest about what are the key enablers, what are the measures that need to be taken. And sometimes those measures include that certain specific positions are strengthened with fresh blood. That brings the right capabilities to the table, or there is a training program that is required, and so forth. So in that particular case, unfortunately, the progress on bringing on board, for example, a CEO was very slow. So after 1 year, there was still no new COO, and that actually in turn slowed down progress. And the other one is this lack of discipline. And I think that's something that you see very common, and you need to have a very upfront and honest discussion already when you prepare the restructuring concept. How disciplined will the organization be to push change through? And what support can you give to the people to actually embrace change? And as well, important, well, if there are some individuals that don't want to embrace change, what is going to happen? So at the end of the day, a lot of things were executed. So I think in that sense, positive. So clearly the plan itself was valid. The implementation itself had ticked many boxes. But on average, what we saw is that it just took 2 or 3 months longer to implement a measure than it should have. And once the measure was live, well, sometimes, people are animals of habits. They try just to sneak back and go back to their old ways, except if there was someone slapping them friendly on the hand and saying, please, let's stick to the new way of doing things. So in that sense, I would say positive but mixed. And that's something where, again, going back to the potential need for external support, I think when it comes to the implementation, in some cases, it should be considered whether you bring on board as well external support for an extended period of time to have this tight grip and visibility on what works, what doesn't, where are delays, what are the risks, how can we mitigate them, and make sure that you have someone that helps you push everyone into the same direction and keep the pressure on the organization. So, in that sense, and this is not necessarily related to this particular case, but and when it comes to the implementation, there are some clear do's and do not do's, and I'm not going to go through all of them individually. But I think the key here is you need to be laser focused, and along the path you will come across obstacles, and the point there is that you need to be flexible to properly navigate this journey. And one of the key dimensions in the journey is the people. So if you don't take your people by the hand and make them the owner of the change, it will just take much longer to get it done. Well, I hope that was interesting. Again, obviously, that's just a little bit of flavor. We could probably talk about each of these pages individually for hours. But so with that, I would like again to open the floor for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Sasan. Before the question, we have Mr. Saad Al-Muaddi. Mr. Saad Al-Muaddi, مدير إدارة التزام الشركات بوكالة الأعمال التجارية والاستثمار بوزارة التجارة. تفضل أستاذ سعد، حياك الله.
السلام عليكم. حياكم الله جميعا. شكرا جزيلا لكم. فقط أود أن أوضح أن الوزارة بادرت ممثلة في وكالة الأعمال التجارية والاستثمار بالتنسيق مع وزارة العدل باعتماد عدد من الخدمات التي يمكن تقديمها للشركات الموقوفة أو بالأصح المتعثرة. وعلى سبيل المثال الشركات المساهمة غير المدرجة، تجديد السجلات التجارية، وعقد الجمعيات العامة للشركات المساهمة سواء كانت الجمعيات العامة العادية والغير عادية، باستثناء ما يتعلق بالاندماج أو التصفية أو تخفيض رأس مال الشركة أو نقل المركز الرئيسي للشركة، وأيضا التعديل على السجل التجاري للشركة وفقا للقرارات الصادرة من الجمعية، باستثناء أيضا الأمور التي تم الإشارة إليها مسبقا. كما يمكن أيضا
أن أذنت لي حتى نوضح لضيوفنا Mr. Sasan and Mr. Said, we have a translate from Arabic to English from the below in the interpretation. اوكي تفضل استاذ سعد.
اود ان اوضح انه حتى التعديل على اعضاء مجلس الاداره للشركات الموقوفه او المتعثره في السجل التجاري يمكن ذلك وفقا لقرارات الجمعيه او مجلس الاداره بتعيين عضو مكان العضو او المقعد الشاغر، ويكون بتقديم اقرار من العضو الجديد بالعلم والدرايه بما على الشركه من حقوق والتزامات للشركه الموقوفه او المتعثره. ايضا يمكن تقديم الخدمات لبقيه الشركات سواء كانت المحدوده وغيرها من انواع الشركات للتجديد تجديد السجل التجاري لتلك الشركات. ايضا الاجراءات النظاميه لقرارات الشركاء بتعديل عقود تاسيس باستثناء التصفيه او الاندماج او تخفيض رأس المال للشركة أو النقل مركزها الرئيسي. كذلك يمكن تقديم نسخة طبق الأصل من الأنظمة الأساسية أو مستخرج من السجل التجاري، بالإضافة إلى إفادة من وزارة التجارة إلى من يهمه الأمر لتلك الشركات. وبناء على ذلك يمكن تقديم تلك الخدمات المشار إليها ليتم رفع الإيقاف وتحديث تلك البيانات المطلوبة، ومن ثم إعادة الإيقاف على السجل التجاري لتلك الشركات، وذلك بهدف أيضا إدارة الأزمات لتلك الشركات من قبل القرارات الصادرة من الشركة ممثلة في مجلس الإدارة أو مجلس المديرين أو الجمعية الخاصة بالشركة، قبل الوصول لمرحلة أو إحدى حالات نظام الإفلاس. أيضا كما تم التنسيق مع المختصين في لجنة الإفلاس في حال صدور إحدى أو أحكام قضائية تتعلق بإحدى حالات نظام الإفلاس كالتنظيم المالي أو التصفية أو التسوية الوقائية، لرفع الإيقاف عن تلك الشركات في ظل صدور تلك الأحكام وفق الآلية المحددة التي تم التنسيق معها مع لجنة الإفلاس. أود أن أوضح فقط، من أراد الاستعلام أو الاستفسار عن تلك الخدمات أو الشروع أكثر في تفاصيلها يمكن التواصل مع إيميل الإدارة العامة للحوكمة والتزام الشركات لتلقي مثل الاستفسارات والإجابة عليها، وهو gcd@mc.gov.sa. شكرا جزيلا لكم.
شكرا للأستاذ سعد، ما قصرت، الله يعافيك. Mr. Sasan and Mr. Saeed Saeed, we can go through the asks as much as you can, and because we have 3 minutes to finish.
Saeed, you want to go?
Yeah, we will start from the bottom, the last one.
It was noticed that some clients were uncomfortable dealing with a financial advisor because the advisor ended up filing a legal case against the client. Interesting. Would you agree that some advisors could be seen as a threat? It's an interesting situation that you allude to, where the advisor and the client ended up in a legal case. And the relationship between an advisor and a client and suppliers and banks, etc., these are all commercial relationships at the end of the day, where yes, I mean, there are possibilities for relationships to deteriorate, but in general, an advisor is sought during a time where a company would need help in achieving the objective it's set out to achieve. So in general, advisors should not be seen as threats. I mean, you should seek an advisor for help rather than to keep them on edge. Situations do happen, but there are ways to make sure there's a clear scope, a clear timeline, a clear role of what the company and the advisor are set out to do, then you should generally be able to avoid such situations. And I hope I answered that question. Would outsourcing or subcontracting be viable tools in turnaround strategies? And it's a good question. There are many tools in the restructuring or turnaround, and companies are encouraged to really explore the multitude of options that they can potentially bring to the table in order to achieve the restructuring objective. And the tools of outsourcing and subcontracting and other tools, as long as they help you in moving forward and be it your goal is to reduce cost or restructure your capital or be able to beat debt obligations, you should consider all tools. And outsourcing is a common tool in restructuring, where let's say there is a function that you're carrying on your books and costing you a lot of money, and someone else can do it better and for should that be something you're after? The same goes with subcontracting, but all these tools need to be assessed and need to be in line with what your objective is in a restructuring.
Sayyid, but excuse me, we have the lawyer يوسف المدني. تفضل أستاذ يوسف. أستاذ يوسف.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
تفضل. يا ليت بالاختصار.
أسأل كان لفت انتباهي الأستاذ من وزارة التجارة، قال إنه الآن في آلية جديدة لإعادة التنظيم المالي كرفع الإيقاف عن السجلات. أنا بصفتي أمين إفلاس ومحامي، وعندي شركة تحت إعادة التنظيم المالي الآن لها 6 أشهر لم تستفد من رفع السجل. فيجب أن نخطر نحن كأمناء إفلاس يعني بهذه الإجراءات اللي أنت قلت عليها مشكورة تقوم بها وزارة التجارة لإخبارها للمدين، لأنه فعلا الشركة معطلة نهائيا عن أي أعمال بسبب الإيقافات على السجلات. المحاضرة كانت شكرا بالنسبة للمحاضرة، طبعا كانت جدا نوعية جدا ممتازة واستفدنا فيها، لأنه جوهر التنظيم المالي هو إعادة هيكلة الشركة قانونيا وماليا وإداريا. فأنا أرجو يعني فعلا يكون لنا يعني إجابة واضحة وشافية كأمناء إفلاس تجي على إيميلاتنا ننبه فيها المدين، مو فقط مثل ما الأستاذ قبل شوي أعطانا الإيميل حتى ما لحقت أسجله. فنبغى يكون في شفافية أكثر.
الله يعافيك. شكرا لك أستاذ سعد، ونتمنى لك إن شاء الله التوفيق بإذن الله. يجاوب عليك الأستاذ سعد معدي إن أذنت للأستاذ سعد. عندنا المداخل الآخر الأستاذ. تفضل أستاذ صدام. تفضل. طيب علشان ما نتأخر، تفضل أستاذ سعد المعدي في إجابة الأستاذ يوسف المدني. مشكور.
ودي بس أخوي الكريم لو أنا بأذكر الإيميل ثاني مرة وارسلته في الشات الآن، فترسل لنا الحالة بالمستندات ونطلع عليها إن شاء الله، وراح يتم التواصل معك وتوجيهك بإذن الله لأقرب فرع للوزارة لتقديم الخدمة. الإيميل هو gcd@mc.gov.sa gcd@mc.gov.sa.
شكرا لك أستاذ سعد، ما قصرت. الله يعافيك. Mr. Sasan, Mr. Said can continue to question and answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I will read out the next question, and I'm reading from the bottom, Abdul Hamid. Sahih? Have you ever faced a situation where banks and/or syndicates work against each other during a restructuring exercise? Can consultants add value in such situations? Absolutely. Great question. Yes, there are definitely situations where, we consider them as one pool, which is the lending pool, but in that pool, you have different kinds of banks and institutions and lenders, all with sometimes common interests and sometimes different interests, right? Certain banks might want, for instance, the company to undergo a restructuring, while other banks see the interest basically in liquidating or fire selling the assets. And this is a common divide that you see between lenders, and it all based on what their perception of your company is, what their analysis has yielded. And this is a perfect time to have an advisor or consultant on board to be able to create this transparency for you to understand what are the interests of the different lenders and banks that you are dealing with, but B, also to come up with solutions and ways to mediate and align the interests in your favor as a company to be able to achieve the restructuring. Because the last thing you want is a divide between interest in your lender pool to prolong your ability to restructure and come back to a healthy state. So it is perfect suggestion to have a consultant on board, because this is where they really add value and manage the different stakeholders involved in the restructuring, creating visibility, and also, you know, being able to drive an alignment of interest so you can progress on your restructuring plan. Sasan, do you want to add something to this?
I mean, perhaps just to add to this. I mean, look, I think the situation happens. It's quite common. It needs to be factored in and needs some smart thinking and strategies how to fix this. I think to a large degree as well, going back, do you need external support to do this? It very much as well depends on the in-house talent that you have, right? And I think that's an important element to highlight. I mean, a strong and experienced CFO, for example, particularly one that has gone through similar debt renegotiation exercises or chief restructuring officer, that's sometimes the right formula to actually to go through those exercises. In some other cases, you might, because you don't have that in-house talent, or because you actually need a broader perspective, and bring additional firepower, bring the independent view with the help of an external advisor. So I think the answer there is always a case-by-case specific one, right? It very much depends on what skills do you have internally, how much is, how intact or how disrupted is the relationship with the banks, and so forth.
I think, Sasan, you've answered another question as well, which is what about the importance of having a qualified finance team or CFO for negotiating with banks? And just like Sasan just said, it is very important, right? And if you have a strong CFO who's seen these situations before, then that goes a long way in helping you deal with a multitude of events and situations you might face undergoing restructuring. So yes, the CFO is a very important role when it comes to this situation.
The time is finished now. I would thank you all, Mr. Sasan and Mr. Said. شكرا لشركائنا في وزارة التجارة للأعمال التجارية والاستثمار. شكرا لشركائنا في رولاند برجر. نشكر الحضور على التفاعل، وبخصوص من لم نجيب عليه نتمنى أن يرسل سؤاله عبر وسائل التواصل أو عبر صفحة اتصل بنا على موقع اللجنة، وسنجيب عليها بإذن الله تعالى. شكرا لكم جميعا، وإلى لقاء آخر إن شاء الله قريب. في أمان الله.
Thank you. شكرا لكم.
Thank you very much.